She was 22 years old, and she owned exactly three things: a wool coat with a missing button, $14 folded into her boot, and a hand plane her teacher had made for her the winter before he died. That was all that was left after her stepfather, Deacon Harwell Grice, of the Millhaven settlement in northern Idaho Territory, presented her with a document she had never seen before. A bill of indebtedness in her late mother's name, tallied against the household accounts of the past 6 years. The figures were written in Grice's own hand. She recognized the cramped, careful loops of a man who chose his words the way he chose his investments, with an eye toward what they could take, not what they could give. The total, he explained, had been transferred to her name upon her mother's death. She was 22, and she owed him everything she didn't have. She was given until sundown to leave the house on Sutter Road. Settle in, friends. Pour something warm and pull up close, because this is the story of Opal Vey, and it begins, as so many of the best ones do, with a woman who had nothing left to lose. Opal had not always been the kind of person who knew how to work with her hands. She had come to it the way most people come to the things that save them, sideways, by accident, through someone else's grace. His name was Edmund Colburn, and he was the carpenter who rented the small workshop at the back of the Sutter Road property. He was 63 years old, a widower from Ohio with large-knuckled hands and the kind of unhurried patience that only comes from a lifetime of making things that need to last. He had arrived in Millhaven 2 years after Opal's mother married Deacon Grice, and he had stayed because the rent was fair and the light in the workshop was good in the afternoons. Opal had begun drifting to the workshop at 15, the way children drift toward warmth. She told herself she was watching out of curiosity. Edmund seemed to understand that what she was really doing was hiding, and he never said a word about it. He just handed her a piece of sandpaper one afternoon and showed her the direction of the grain, and that was how it started. Over the next 7 years, he taught her everything: how to read a board for its straightness, how to feel the moisture content in the wood by laying your palm flat against it, how to sharpen a blade until it could shave the fine hairs off your forearm, how to cut a dovetail joint so clean and tight it needed no glue to hold. He taught her that every piece of wood has a story running through it: the tight rings of hard years, the wide rings of seasons with good rain, and that a person who takes the time to read it will always know which way the wood wants to move. The winter before he died of a heart complaint, Edmund sat her down at the workbench and pressed something into her hands. It was a hand plane he had built himself, the body shaped from a single piece of seasoned cherry wood, the iron set at the precise angle he had spent decades perfecting, the tote and knob turned smooth as river stone. On the toe of the plane he had stamped her initials with a small die he'd made for the purpose. O.V. "This'll outlast both of us," he said. "That's the point." She kept it wrapped in a square of waxed canvas after he died. She carried it with her the afternoon Deacon Grice handed her the document, and she carried it down the road away from the only place she had ever felt like she belonged. She walked north, not because she had a plan, but because north meant the river, and the river meant fresh water, and fresh water was the one thing she knew she would need. The settlement of Millhaven fell away behind her in the blue dust of late afternoon, and she did not look back. She had learned by then that looking back cost more than it gave. The country north of town was rougher, less settled, a long broken stretch of cutover timberland and steep creek drainages that folded down toward the river valley. The logging companies had come through 15 years before, taken what they wanted, and left behind a landscape of stumps and slash piles that had mostly grown over now with alder and young fir. It was not a beautiful place, exactly, but it was honest. It did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. She made camp that first night under a cedar that had been too crooked for the loggers to bother with. She ate the hard biscuits she had thought to put in her coat pockets before she left, drank from the creek, and sat for a long time in the dark listening to the water move over the stones. She felt no despair. That surprised her a little. What she felt instead was a kind of stripped-down clarity, the same feeling she sometimes got when she was deep in a difficult piece of joinery and everything unnecessary had fallen away, and there was only the problem in front of her and the tools in her hands. Grice had taken the house and the workshop and the 6 years of her young womanhood. He had not taken the one thing that mattered. She was a carpenter. She was a good one. And tomorrow she would work. It was on the second morning of following the river that she found the mill. She almost missed it. The trail dropped down into a hollow where an old creek joined the river, and the brush had grown up so thick around the building that she was nearly past it before she registered what she was seeing. She stopped. pushed through a stand of young alder, and there it was. It had been a small sawmill once. The framework was still standing, heavy posts and beams of Douglas fir, hand-hewn, the notches and tenons as tight as the day they were cut. The roof had gone mostly to rot, the cedar shakes crumbling and patched with moss, and the great iron saw blade had seized into rust in the middle of its arbor. The log deck where the timber had once been staged was buried under decades of leaf litter and vine maple. The flume that had brought water from the creek to drive the wheel was collapsed along most of its length. Though the wheel itself, a massive overshot construction of iron and seasoned oak, was still standing. 3 of its paddles were broken, but the shaft was sound. To anyone passing through, it was a ruin, a reminder of someone else's failure, something the forest was slowly and patiently taking back. Opal stood in the ankle-deep fern and looked at it for a long time. She looked at the beams, and the beams were still good. She looked at the posts, and the posts were plumb. She looked at the wheel, and the wheel, she thought, could turn again. She saw not a ruin, but a skeleton. Something that had lost its skin but not its bones. Something that could be brought back. She made herself slow down. She walked the perimeter of the building twice, running her hand along the timbers, pressing her thumb into the wood at suspicious-looking spots to test for soft rot. She climbed the frame at one corner, moving carefully, testing each member before she trusted her weight to it. What she found was this. The structure was almost entirely sound. Someone had built this mill with the intention of it lasting, and the wood they had used, old-growth fir, dense and resinous, had resisted decades of neglect better than any modern lumber could have. The roof was the problem. Without a roof, the rain came straight in, and rain was the enemy of wood. But the roof could be rebuilt. She climbed down and sat on the log deck in the thin morning sun, $14 in her boot, the hand plane in its waxed canvas, and in front of her, something that no one in the valley seemed to think was worth a second look. She felt, been in this situation before. She spent the rest of that day, and the next in Millhaven, asking careful questions of the right people. She found out that the mill had belonged to a man named Cresswell Oates, who had built it 40 years back and run it for 20, before a dispute over the water rights with the timber company had driven him out. The property had passed to the county for unpaid taxes and had been sitting idle ever since. She found the county land office, a single room at the back of the assay building, where a clerk named Pell spent his days surrounded by stacks of paper that smelled of mildew and old tobacco. She asked about the mill site. Pell looked up at her over the top of his spectacles. He was the kind of man who conveyed importance through the slowness of his movements. "The Oates Mill," he said, as though placing it. "That property hasn't had any interest in years. What would it cost to take on the salvage rights?" Another long pause. He made a show of consulting a ledger. "Well," he said, "the county's primary interest is in clearing the tax liability. That comes to $8 and some change." He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who doesn't expect to be taken seriously. "For $8 you'd have salvage rights to the structure and whatever's on the lot. Land itself stays county property." She counted out $8.40 onto his desk. He looked at the money, then at her, then back at the money. "You understand," he said. "It's just an old wreck of a building out there." "I understand," she said. "I'll take the receipt." She walked back to the mill with $5.60 left to her name. The mocking started almost immediately. It is a particular quality of small settlements that word travels faster than feet, and, by the time Opal arrived at the hollow the following morning, with her coat and her canvas sack and her hand plane, there were already 2 men leaning on their horses, at the top of the ridge looking down at her. "What do you figure to do with that place?" One of them called. His voice had the carrying quality of a man accustomed to not having to repeat himself. She didn't answer. She set down her sack, unwrapped the hand plane, and got to work. They watched for a while. Then they rode on. In the weeks that followed, the hollow became the full world. She rose before light and worked until she couldn't see. She started with the roof because that was the most urgent problem, and because she had decided she would not waste a single board from outside if she could help it. The collapsed flume gave her lumber. She dismantled it section by section, carefully pulling the iron spikes and stacking the planks by length. The wood was dry and well seasoned, and most of it was still sound. She split the rotten pieces for firewood and set the rest aside. The work was hard in a way that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with patience. She could not simply nail new shakes to the old structure. The old rafters were bowed in places where the rot had gotten in from above. And if she didn't fix that first, Any roof she put on would fail within a season. She sistered new material to the bowed rafters, shimming them true with small wedges she cut by hand. She used her plane constantly, truing surfaces, adjusting fits, taking thin, curling shavings from a board's edge until it seated perfectly against its neighbor with no gap. The sound of the plane moving through the wood was the one consistent thing in her days. A smooth, deliberate whisper. People from the valley road above would stop and look down sometimes. A few called out things she chose not to hear. One afternoon, a woman pulled her wagon over, climbed down and made her way down the slope on foot. She was, perhaps 50, with a broad face and the direct gaze of someone who had long since stopped softening her opinions. "I watched my late husband try to fix up a bad building for 10 years, the woman said. "It took everything he had. Just so you know what you're in for." "What happened to the building?" Opal asked. "Still standing, he was the one who gave out." The woman looked at the framework, taking it in with a slow, assessing eye. "That's good timber." "Yes, ma'am. It is." The woman climbed back up the slope without another word. But 2 days later she sent her hired man down with a sack of cornmeal and a slab of bacon, and a note that said only, "Roof before anything else." Her name was Ida Harwick, and she ran the small farm on the ridge above the hollow. Opal ate the bacon and thought about the roof, which she was already working on. She took the note as the highest form of compliment. The roof took 3 weeks. When it was done, the rafters sistered true, the sheathing tight, the new cedar shakes laid in proper overlapping courses. She stood inside the building in the rain and listened to the water hit the roof and run off, and not a drop came through. She had not realized until that moment how much she had needed to hear that. The sound of a thing working as it should. She turned her attention to the wheel. It was the heart of the problem, and also, she suspected, the heart of the opportunity. A mill without water power was just a building. A mill with water power was a mill. The wheel itself was largely intact. It was the flume that was the issue, and she had already broken the flume down for lumber. She needed to rebuild it. She had replaced perhaps a third of the flume with salvaged material when she found the box. She was working near the intake structure, the small stone and timber head works, where the flume began at the creek, clearing decades of accumulated debris from around the base. There were layers of it, leaf mold and silt and waterlogged branches, packed in by the pressure of floods and compressed by time into something almost like soil. She was working with a flat spade in her hands, methodical and unhurried when the spade struck something solid, not stone. She cleared away the material around it carefully, working with her fingers. What she found was a wooden box, roughly 18 inches square, built from the same dense fir as the mill itself, its lid fitted with a precision that was unmistakably deliberate. It had been set into the base of the intake structure and then buried, not dropped, not forgotten, placed. She brought it inside the mill before she opened it. She set it on the workbench in the thin gray light from the new roof opening and ran her hands over it for a moment, feeling the joinery, dovetailed corners. The same hand that had built the mill had built this box. There was a small iron latch on the front, simple, the kind a person could pick with a nail if they needed to. She took a nail from her coat pocket and she opened it. The lid swung up on its own and rested against her arm. Inside, packed carefully in folded oilcloth, were documents, a stack of them, tied with a length of thin leather cord. She untied the cord and spread the papers on the workbench. The first was a deed, the original deed to the mill property and the water rights, dated 41 years earlier, made out to Cresswell Oates, and recorded in the name of the Territorial Land Office. She had never seen a land deed this old. The paper had the texture of something that had been important, and the seal at the bottom was still sharp. She read it, slowly, and then she turned to the next document and read that slowly too. By the time she reached the bottom of the stack, her hands were not quite steady. The documents told a story that the county land office did not. They told the story of a water rights dispute that had not been a dispute at all, but an orchestrated theft. The timber company that had driven Cresswell Oates out, the one that had contested his water rights in the county courts 40 years ago, had done so on the basis of a survey document that, according to the correspondence in this box, had been falsified. The original survey, the one that had been quietly buried here at the head of the flume, showed the creek's course differently than the version submitted to the court. The timber company's claim had rested entirely on the altered survey. The original made their claim impossible. But that was not the worst of it. The worst of it was a letter. It was written in a careful, educated hand on paper with a printed letterhead. Gryson Aldrich, Land and Timber Brokerage, Millhaven, Idaho Territory. The letter was dated 39 years ago. It was addressed to the manager of the timber company, and it outlined, in the clinical language of business correspondence, the arrangement by which the falsified survey would be presented to the court. The Oates claim defeated, and the mill property eventually folded into a larger parcel that the brokerage would acquire on behalf of unnamed investors. The signature at the bottom was neat and small. H. Grice, partner, Harwell Grice's father. She sat down on the workbench and stared at the letter for a long time. She had come here with nothing. She had bought the salvage rights to this ruin with $8 of her last 14. Because she had nowhere else to go, and something in the bones of the place had spoken to her. And now, sitting in the mill, she had spent 3 weeks slowly bringing back to life. She held in her hands a document that explained precisely and in someone else's handwriting how the family that had thrown her out had originally gotten rich. The knowledge settled into her the way cold does. Not all at once, but gradually, finding every gap and hollow and filling it. She thought about Cresswell Oates, who had built this mill and lost it. She thought about the box set into the foundation with such deliberate care. She thought about the man who had hidden it here and what he had hoped or feared or understood. She thought, he knew someone would find this. He put it here so someone would. She rewrapped the documents in the oilcloth and set them in the corner of the mill behind a stack of flume planks. She went to the creek and washed her face and hands and stood for a while in the cold air, thinking. Then she went back to work. The weeks that followed were not idle. She finished the flume intake, fitted the new paddles to the wheel, and began the careful work of rehabilitating the machinery inside the mill. She had never worked with the mechanical side of a sawmill before. But the principles were the same as joinery. You learned the thing by taking it apart, understanding each component, and putting it back together correctly. She documented what she found, sketching the gear trains in a small notebook she'd bought with a quarter of her remaining money. She also began, quietly, to ask questions about the timber company. It had gone through several changes of ownership and name in the decades since Oates had lost his claim, but the current operation, a company called Cascade and Northern Timber, was still active in the valley. Its local manager was a man named Flint Garrow, who rode a large bay horse and wore the same expression of expansive confidence that she had come to associate with men who had never once doubted that the world was arranged for their comfort. She learned, through careful conversation with Ida Harwick and a few others who came down to the hollow to see how the work was progressing, that Cascade and Northern had been pressing the county for access to the creek above the old mill site. They wanted the water for a new operation further up the valley. The county had been considering the request. There were those in Millhaven who favored it, and Deacon Harwell Grice was among the most vocal of them. She sat with this information for several days. Then she went to find the county surveyor. His name was Tobias Reck, and she found him at the assay building, where he was working at a large drafting table, covered with maps and field notes. He was a younger man than she had expected, methodical and precise in his movements, with the ink-stained fingers of someone who spent as much time writing as he did in the field. She introduced herself. She told him she had been doing salvage work on the old Oates Mill site. She said she had found some documents she thought he ought to see. He listened with the careful, non-committal attention of a man in a technical profession who has learned that most people who come to him with extraordinary claims are mistaken about the significance of what they have found. He unfolded the original survey. He compared it to the version in the county records, which he retrieved from the filing cabinet behind him. The room went quiet in the way. Rooms go quiet when something important is happening. He looked at the two surveys for a long time. He looked at the letter from Grice and Aldrich. He set it down very carefully on the corner of the drafting table and looked at it from a slight distance, as though proximity to it made him uncomfortable. "Where exactly did you find these?" he said. She told him. She told him about the box buried in the intake foundation, the oilcloth, the way it had been fitted and sealed. As she talked, she watched his face, and what she saw there was not the expression of a man being told something unbelievable. It was the expression of a man recognizing something he had long suspected. "The water rights case," he said. "I inherited the files when I took this job. There were things about the original survey that never sat right with me. The creek's course, as described in the record, it didn't match what I could see in the field. But the documents were of record, and I had no grounds to challenge them." He looked at her. "You understand what this means for the current county petition?" "I think so," she said. "I figured you'd know better than me." He did. Tobias Reck was not a man given to dramatic gestures, but what he did in the days that followed was as consequential as anything that happened in the Millhaven Valley that year. He submitted a formal challenge to the county records on the basis of the documents Opal had provided. He engaged the Territorial Land Office. He wrote, in precise and meticulous language, a report that laid out the discrepancy between the original and the recorded surveys, and drew the only conclusion the facts permitted. The county petition by Cascade and Northern Timber was suspended pending review. And then, because these things move faster in small places than people expect, everything else moved at once. Deacon Harwell Grice, whose name appeared in the land office records as a beneficiary of the original Oates property transfer, was notified that he was under investigation for land fraud. The notification came by way of a territorial marshal who arrived in Millhaven on a gray Tuesday morning and went directly to Grice's house on Sutter Road. The confrontation, as Opal heard it described later, was brief. Grice had the kind of piety that presents itself as unassailable right up to the moment it is directly challenged, and then it folds like wet paper. He looked at the letter with his father's signature. He looked at the original survey. And then he looked at the marshal and said nothing at all. He was taken to the territorial seat to face formal proceedings. The Cascade and Northern petition was denied permanently when the water rights were found to revert to the original Oates claim, which meant they reverted to the property that Opal had purchased salvage rights to for $8.40. It took the better part of a month for the legal dust to settle, and for Opal to understand fully what she now held. The territorial court, in its determination, ruled that the original deed, the one from the oilcloth, the one Cresswell Oates had hidden in the foundation of the thing he built, constituted the valid instrument of title, the water rights attached to it. The property reverted to its original boundaries, and as the legal purchaser of the property's salvage rights, holding the only valid claim in an uncontested transfer, Opal Vey was found to be the rightful heir to the title. She owned the mill. She stood in the building the afternoon. The clerk from the land office brought her the paperwork, and she looked at what she had made of the place in the months since she had first pushed through the alder, and found it. The roof was tight. The wheel was turning. She had got it moving the week before, and the sound of it, the deep, slow creak and rush of water over the paddles, was the most satisfying sound she had ever heard. The saw blade had come free of its rust with patience and proper oil and a week of careful attention. The log deck was cleared. The building was clean and dry, and smelled of fresh-cut wood and the particular green mineral scent of the creek. It was not finished. It would not be finished for a long time. There was more machinery to restore, the yard to clear, a proper road to cut down from the ridge. There were agreements to make with the small logging operations in the valley, who had been carting their timber to mills hours away, because there was no one closer. There were 100 things she did not yet know how to do that she would learn by doing. But the bones were right. She had known that from the first morning. She sat down on the log deck in the late afternoon light, the hand plane in her lap, and looked out through the open mill door at the wheel turning in the creek. The water caught the last of the sun and threw it in small bright pieces across the floor. Edmund Colburn had made the plane for her hands specifically. She could feel it in the way the weight distributed across her palm, the way the tote fit her grip. Every time she picked it up, she felt the specific patience of the man who had made it. The understanding that a thing done right takes the time it takes, and not 1 minute less. She thought about Cresswell Oates, who had built this mill with his hands, and then spent 40 years watching someone else hold the paper on it. She thought about the box he had hidden in the foundation. Not in bitterness, she had decided, but in hope. You don't seal documents in dovetailed hardwood and bury them in a foundation unless you believe there is a future in which they will matter. He had known the truth was in them. He had trusted that eventually someone would come looking. She had not come looking. She had come with nowhere else to go, but here she was. Word spread the way it does in small valleys, along the lines of practical interest and human curiosity. The mill at the hollow was open. Opal Vey was running it, and her work was careful, and her prices were fair. The first few customers came cautiously, the way people do when they're not sure what to expect. They left satisfied. They told others. Ida Harwick came down one morning with a load of timber from her woodlot that she'd been holding for 2 years, waiting for a mill within a reasonable distance. She stood in the yard and watched Opal run the first board through the saw, watching the kerf open clean and straight along the length of the log, the sawdust rising in a fine pale spray. She picked up the board when it came through, sighted down its face, ran her thumb along the sawn edge. "Your late teacher taught you well," she said. He did, Opal said. He really did. Ida set the board down and looked at her with that direct, undiluted gaze. I sent the cornmeal because I thought you had grit, she said. I send my timber because you have skill. Those are two different things. Opal understood the distinction, and she was grateful for it. There were those in Millhaven who had benefited from the arrangement between the Grice family and Cascade and Northern, and they did not immediately warm to the new order of things. But a mill is a practical necessity, and practicality has a way of overcoming reluctance in small communities. One by one they came, and one by one, they found that the woman running the mill at Red Hollow Creek had no interest in settling scores. She was interested in working, and she was good at it, and that was enough. She hired her first helper in the spring, a boy of 16 named Waylon, who had grown up in a family of loggers and knew timber but had never worked in a mill. She taught him the way Edmund had taught her. By starting with the simplest things and building up, by letting him ask every question without impatience, by reminding him that the wood would tell him what it needed if he learned to listen. She kept the hand plane on the high shelf above the workbench, where she could see it from anywhere in the building. She used it still, for the fine work, the fitting of a difficult joint, or the truing of a surface that needed to be exactly right. But mostly it sat there on its shelf, its cherry wood body warm in the light, a reminder of the specific kind of person it was possible to become, given time and the right teacher and the willingness to be shown. The wheel turned, the saw ran, the mill filled, slowly, with the sounds of good work being done. Opal Vey was 22 years old when Deacon Harwell Grice handed her a fraudulent document and told her she had until sundown to leave. She walked out with $14 in a hand plane and spent $8.40 of that on the salvage rights to a building no one thought was worth the cost of tearing down. It was the best $8 she ever spent. We hope this story found you well tonight. If it stayed with you, we'd love it if you shared it with someone who could use a reminder that the things worth having are often hiding in the places everyone else has already given up on. Before you go, we want to ask you something, and we genuinely read every answer. What is something in your own life that others wrote off, that you saw value in anyway? Tell us in the comments. We'll be there.